Hello, everyone. Welcome to another timely JINSA webinar. I'm JINSA's Director of Foreign Policy, Jonathan Rui. Today, we'll be discussing the implication of Iran's election. And for those of you who are fans of The Who out there, you can probably guess by the title, potentially what we think of the new boss, but I'll leave that to our two experts here. On July 5th, just 2 months after the surprise death of former President Raisi in a helicopter crash, Dr. Masoud Pezeshkian defeated Saeed Jalili in the second round runoff of Iran's presidential elections. His victory is widely being portrayed as a win for moderate reformism over a hardliner, and it comes amid a growing discussion of the potential succession of alien Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei in the wake of the unexpected death of who may have been his chosen successor, President Raisi. To get into all of this and much more, I'm delighted to be joined today by two experts on these issues and the broader context in which they're taking place. Mariam Mimarsadaki is a founder and director of the Cyrus Forum for Iran's Future and is a senior fellow at the MacDonald-Laurier Institute. Dr. Ray Takei is Hasib J. Sabag Senior Fellow for Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and a long-serving member of JINSA's Iran Policy Project. He's the author of several books, most recently, The Last Shah. If you're interested in learning more about that, we've got a book webinar on JINSA's website that I recommend everyone to go back and look through. So I guess, Ray, I'll start with you. I think I'll just pose the broadest, but maybe one of the more thorny questions, which is, you don't have to look very far in the American press to see the president-elect portrayed as a moderate, a change of pace from the hardliner he defeated in the runoff election. So I guess I'll start with a very broad question for you: is Pezeshkian is the new president-elect? Is it meaningful to call him a reformer or a moderate, or are these sort of terms that we in America are trying to superimpose upon him, or do we even know enough about him?
Thank you for having me. It's good to be with everybody. Well, this, to say the least, this was an election that Iran did not anticipate. It was a succession crisis that it did not anticipate. They anticipated President Raisi to finish his term and run for the second term. But it was a meaningful election in a number of respects. The Islamic Republic had traditionally used elections as safety valves. They give people an opportunity to select among a number of different candidates without necessarily disrupting the power relationships within the system. That had not been the case in the previous presidential election of 2021. So in that sense, it's returning to that type of, if you say, crowd management. I think this is very much Mr. Pezeshkian, Dr. Pezeshkian is very much paradoxically a beneficiary of the women's life freedom movement, because essentially it gives the public some impression of different choices that they have in front of them, and the impression that they can register their grievances to the political process as opposed to street protests. The reform is something specific, as I understand it, in a lexicon of the Islamic Republic. It was an idea born in the early 1990s. Essentially, it was a bold idea at that time. Many of the reformers at that time sought to reconceptualize the Islamic Republic with more emphasis on the elected institutions, the parliament, the presidency, the elected local councils, expansion of civil society, rule of law, freedom of press, and so forth. They challenged even the absolutism of the supreme leader's office, and turning late in his tenure, the reformist president Khatami introduced two amendments to the constitution that didn't get through the parliament. Since then, the word reform has been purged of all its lofty aspirations. Reform today means somebody who's more on the left-wing spectrum of the Islamic politics, who believes in economic efficiency, better management, maybe less confrontational foreign policy, but largely stay within the parameters of the system. And Dr. Pezeshkian has been insisting throughout his campaign and since his campaign that he will adhere and abide by the preferences of the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. he has been very deferential to that authority, at least in name so far, as one can tell. So in that particular sense, the definition of reform has changed. It's become a member of the establishment who's perhaps a little less confrontational than Dr. Jalili would have been. In that sense, there was a choice for the people of Iran between the stern revolutionary dogma of Jalili and a more reasonable attitude of Dr. Pezeshkian, and they seem to have opted for the latter. Now Dr. Pezeshkian has been talking about national unity government, a government based on technocrats, a government that draws on all segments of the Islamic Republic, and so forth. What Ali Khamenei likes in his president is compliance, some degree of competence, although that's not necessary. And Pezeshkian actually will probably fulfill that role. You're not really a firebrand at age 70. He was never really an insider in the Islamic Republic the way Hassan Rouhani was. He's been around the system for a long time, but on the edges of power. And I think he'll be a sort of a reasonable custodian of the office of presidency. He may or may not have a role in the larger decisions that are made on the national security front. But I think his principal task is to try to calm down the Iranian society, which has been rebellious. And that's his principal impression that he wants to leave. And if that succeeds, and the Iranian society is more tempered and more calm and less rebellious and unruly, then that's the appropriate national context for the coming succession crisis to the Supreme Leader's office. Notionally, Pezeshkian could be in power for 8 years, and that means by the time his term expires, his second term, Ali Khamenei would either be dead or 93. So, or somewhere in between. And so that in that sense, he may actually prove to be good, safe hands, the way Jalili, I think, was feared would not be. I'll stop there.
No, that's very helpful for setting the table and the context here. And I want to circle back around to discuss the issue of succession and where we go in the future a little bit later in the discussion. I also neglected to mention for our audience, if you have any questions you'd like me to pose to our panelists, just type them into the Q&A box in the bottom of your screen, and I'll do my best to address them in turn. Mariam, I'd like to turn to you to discuss the elections themselves. We've heard that at least in the first round of voting in late June, that it was, I think I've seen a number of 40% turnout, which was I've seen described as the lowest turnout rate for an Iranian presidential election since the revolution. In terms of the election itself, do we know? I mean, does this tell you much about sort of the popularity or public interest in the election? What if from inside Iran, and especially given the context that Ray mentioned of obviously the protests that have been going on for years, but also now this desire for some perhaps some calm from the regime from the top down. Could you give our listeners some context of how these elections were viewed inside Iran?
Sure. Thank you for having me. It's good to be back at JINSA, and honored to be speaking alongside Ray Takei, who I respect so much. The regime poll number that you mentioned, about 40% or roughly 50% in the runoff, it's the regime number. It's the number that the regime has put out to the society and to the international community. And unfortunately, it's one that's just repeated by global press. But anecdotal evidence shows that this is an election that was widely boycotted. Small towns, big cities, people posted to social media videos and pictures of very empty poll stations. There was a very robust campaign to boycott the election prior to it, not just by activists outside the country and opposition leaders outside the country, but also teachers unions, other trade associations, women's rights organizations, student groups, and again, ordinary people coming online and saying, don't legitimize this regime that has killed so many people by participating in its elections. I should say that this is not a new tactic by Iranian people agitating for freedom. It's 20 years now since Khatami's presidency, and by the end of his presidency, Khatami was being very much rejected by the students and the youth and the women who had brought him to become the Islamic Republic's first reformist president. And the youth and the women, especially society at large, really kind of detested Khatami towards the end because he didn't speak up when student protesters were massacred. And so that's the backdrop. I mean, totalitarian regimes kind of sustain themselves through the lack of memory, of forgetfulness. It's been 20 years that Iranians have been shouting, against the reformists. In the protests in late 2017, 2018, there was an important slogan used by the street protesters, "Islah talab usulgara dige tamum majara." Reformists, hardliners, the gig is up, the game is over. So really very directly, and other slogans directly taking aim at the reformists, because it was the reformists, Rouhani, who was in power when the JCPOA was in effect. And not only did people not see their livelihood, their lives improve, economic conditions actually worsened while the JCPOA was in effect. And those protests were the backdrop to the Woman Life Freedom revolution, really, that erupted across the country, and also the diaspora in every part of the world really regularly coming out onto the streets, chanting Woman Life Freedom, which was unmistakably a call for overthrow. So, and then Woman Life Freedom revolution that was brutally crushed, but still, in my opinion, very much remains in the hearts and minds of the Iranian people, is the backdrop to this election. Very much agree with Ray that it is this election in particular, but elections in general, are the regime's way of managing the population, managing expectations, managing discourse, managing what is seen as possible by the people. The fact that they boycotted this election in particular, probably in the biggest way that they've ever boycotted an election, as I mentioned, they have boycotted previous elections as well, is indicative of the fact that they see, one, no improvement in their own lives, in terms of their rights, in terms of their economic welfare, in terms of management of the country, whether it's a reformist in power or a hardliner. In fact, they have a lot more resentment and anger, arguably, against the reformists than they do the hardliners. And second, they didn't vote because very prominent people inside the country whose children were killed, or whose siblings are currently being tortured, or who suffered rape, or whose parents were gunned down on the streets, came out and said any vote for anybody participating in these elections legitimizes the brutality of the regime.
So thank you. That was very helpful. And I want to sort of follow through on a couple of things there. You mentioned a totalitarian regime, and in my simple mind, when I think of falsified turnouts, I usually think in terms of totalitarian regimes, say 97, 99%, and even this 40% figure that they gave would be a misrepresentation in inflation. From the regime's perspective, I know I'm asking you to conduct a perhaps impossible thought exercise here, but if you're Khamenei, or more broadly speaking, the regime with a capital R, to what extent is this incredibly low turnout and all the voices coming forward that you mentioned in the opposition to the election? To what extent is that set the hair on the back of their neck on edge? Are they, do they feel weak or concerned about this? Is it possible to even know?
I think that it is the nature of a repressive regime to always feel insecure about its power, because it knows that it's ruling by fear and force. In the case of this regime at this moment in its history, I think it's more aware than ever of how much it's rejected by the population at large. The 2017-18 protests that I mentioned were really led by the mustazafin, or the downtrodden, in whose name the revolution was waged in the first place. So the fact that the poor, the working class, the rural areas, the small towns are as against the regime, if not even more than the big cities, must worry the regime. And the fact that there was a full-blown revolution, a woman-like freedom revolution, has got to make them also insecure. They know that they have a high level of corruption, but because it's a totalitarian regime with no accountability, they have no means to correct it, even if they wanted to. They have no means to become competent, even if they wanted to. So these are their own self-knowledge, their knowledge of their own weaknesses, their inability to respond to the needs of the people is what I think probably worries them as much as the protests. I want to get, at some point today, I want to get into how the opposition is faring now. And because when we talk about political change in Iran, I agree with Ray that it's certainly not going to come from anything that's government-led, anything that's from the reformists, for example, or anything else that has to do with succession crisis with the supreme leader or anything like that. When we talk about real change that would impact foreign policy, that would impact Israel, that would impact human rights, anything like that, then it's got to be, well, what are the people of Iran doing and saying, and what is the political opposition doing and saying? So I'll come back to that.
Yes, and thank you for bringing that up. I want to devote a serious chunk of time in the back half to discussing that. And as you mentioned in your opening remarks, you talked about a lack of memory and how quickly these things can subside. And I worry that especially here in the United States, where we have plenty of distractions and short memories to begin with, that bears repeating and magnification. Ray, I want to pivot to you. I just asked a question about how the regime feels potentially internally, and would love to get your thoughts on that. But I'll do it by way of asking you the complement to that, which is, if I'm sitting in Tehran and I'm on the levers of power, I've at least got to feel pretty good about my regional position. I've got to feel, maybe more ascendant than I have at any point since the revolution. We can get in the nuclear program, in due course. But I would love your thoughts as a complement to Mariam's. What do you think the regime's sense of its own confidence is, maybe in the region more broadly, at least?
I think allowing Pezeshkian to run and not consolidating the conservative vote behind a single candidate, which Ali Khamenei could have done if he had said to Ghalibaf or Saeed Jalili, one of you drop out, so we have the conservative vote behind one person and we wrap this up in the first round of elections. I think the fact that that didn't happen reflects the fact, and I think Mariam is right, the regime's self-awareness is quite important, because coming out of the women life freedom movement, the regime appreciated its vulnerabilities, namely that it would be difficult to sustain its power through mere repression. So in some way, they must have doubted the resilience of their own security services when dealing with a national movement over a prolonged period of time. Because just repression didn't seem to do they were concerned, must have been, as a tactic, repression may not prove viable if they confront another movement with greater degree of internal cohesion and perhaps resilience. So they went back to elections as a means of crowd control. It is a very hard thing to do for anybody to come out to the street and challenge a regime that has monopoly of lethal power. That's a very hard thing for anyone to do. It might be easier for at least some people to believe, well, maybe we'll get some relief with Pezeshkian and therefore averting another uprising. I don't think that's going to work, but that's what the regime is banking on. So this particular election demonstrated two things. Number one, it's entirely possible that Ali Khamenei was not satisfied with the performance of Ebrahim Raisi in the presidency. He might have been too incompetent, too belligerent, so on and so forth. And he was not reviving the Islamic Republic's fortunes. I don't think he was killed, so I'm not going to get into that. But his death offered an opportunity to recalibrate the system for a leader that usually tinkers with the system a lot, Ali Khamenei. In terms of foreign policy, you're both right, and also that the regime's foreign policy is extraordinarily successful. I think the axis of resistance has succeeded beyond their imagination. The fact that they can mobilize this auxiliary force at limited cost, deploy it wherever they want with relative impunity. Mm-hmm. And I think their boldness was demonstrated in April when they undertook a direct attack against Israel. But, and there's always a but, I'm not quite sure if that successful foreign policy that is satisfying from an ideological point of view redounds to the regime's advantage at home. I'm not sure if the Iranians look at Gaza and Iranian involvement in Gaza and say, wow, this has been a very effective and productive strategy for us. Mm-hmm. I don't know who among the Iranian people looks at their involvement in a war in Central Europe and say, you know what, that's exactly where we should be. I don't know if any of them look at China's colonization of Iran as a fulfillment of the revolution's slogan of independence, autonomy, and self-reliance. I don't know if any of them look at dependence on Russia, which they have all kinds of cultural stereotypes about, as an indication of national stature. So from the regime's perspective, the foreign policy it is pursuing is succeeding, but it is also widening the gap between the regime and the population. Mm-hmm. So paradoxically, again, and this is all about paradoxes in this situation, the regime's, the more it succeeds, the more it compromises itself at home. The more it succeeds abroad, the way it is succeeding, the more it is compromising its standing abroad. I just say the 25-year agreement that they signed with China, I don't know if that's not been implemented. That is a kind of agreement that Persian monarchs used to sign with British colonialists, where you concede your entire economy to foreign ownership and foreign manipulation at advantageous prices for the foreigners. This was what the revolution was supposed to end. And now it finds itself as a supplicant in the worst possible way.
So thank you, Ray. That was a lot to unpack there, but I think that was very, very helpful discussion. Mariam, given the sort of the size of that topic and this issue of the role of foreign policy in the regime's legitimacy or lack thereof, do you have anything to add in terms of sort of to the extent we can understand it, the Iranian populace's view of this foreign policy? I remember in 2017 and 18 when Iran was paying more direct costs for its regional expansionism, that was at least reported to be a slogan of opposition to the regime's policies. You know, who cares for Yemen or Gaza? I'm more focused on issues here at home. So is there anything you want to add in substance or context in terms of those issues of the regime's foreign policy versus its domestic legitimacy?
Yes, I mean, the slogans have been consistent. نه غزه نه لبنان جونم فدای ایران, not Gaza, not Lebanon, my life for Iran. They lie when they say that the enemy is America, the enemy is right here. Many, and maybe most important or most visually compelling is that, you know, Iranians refuse to walk on the flag of Israel when it's on the ground to show disrespect to Israel. They walk around it even when it's a crowd and it's tough to do. They walk around it. They refuse to show disrespect to Israel and the flag of the United States as well. For sure, no reasonable person wants to have the money that could be going to them, to their healthcare, to their education, to battling the environmental crisis, go to fund terror groups, terror proxies throughout the Middle East. I mean, it doesn't take much to understand that that's not a policy that benefits them, and they're very aware of it. I mean, Iran today is quite different than even 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Social media is almost ubiquitous. People are watching TV channel, satellite TV broadcasts that are giving them very accurate news and information. There's just a whole lot of awareness and understanding about what's going on. If I can, if it's okay to get into now, I want to get into a little bit of why did the Woman Life Freedom revolution fall apart and not make it. I wrote a piece for Persuasion about this, and I want to maybe take a couple minutes on that, if that's okay.
Please, yes.
Yeah. So Ray knows this because his wife Suzanne Maloney was involved in. She was the moderator for a panel at the Munich Security Conference that brought together opposition forces there at the Munich Security Conference. So very important development. A couple of years ago, the conference refused to invite anyone from the regime because of its repression of Woman Life Freedom Revolution, and instead invited the Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, Masih Alinejad, and Nazanin Boniadi, the three of them, and an important panel moderated by Suzanne Maloney took place there. Shortly after, however, this Georgetown coalition that was a historic unification of individuals, leading individuals who opposed the Islamic Republic, it fell apart. And it's important to understand what happened, because if Iran is going to have real change, we need to understand what kind of a moment it's in. There are deep fissures right now in the opposition and a lot of animosity, schadenfreude, unfortunately, for different opposition leaders. And a lot of vitriol going back and forth. And the Georgetown Coalition was really a sign of hope for many Iranians. The Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi decided to exit it. And even though he himself has talked really for decades about tolerance and pluralism, unity, a culture of democracy, right now there's a situation where people who are closely connected to him, seen to be close to him, are really contradicting that message in important ways. So Reza Pahlavi talks about transitional justice and the rule of law. There are people, and they're not a few of them, and some of them are very prominent, talking about how it'll be necessary to hang people from lampposts after some kind of transition from this current regime. And the extremes are being aided by the regime's cyber army. So the regime's cyber army has a very sophisticated campaign of bolstering the extremist discourse and pitting these opposition forces, opposition people against each other, creating an environment online that is very distrustful, that conveys to the average Iranian a sense of dismay, lack of hope, confusion, and backing out of the kind of hope and galvanization that the Woman Life Freedom Revolution was about. So the extremes are aided by the regime online, and right now you have people very close to Reza Pahlavi, for example, who just until maybe 2 years ago were writing for regime outlets and were very closely aligned with the regime, showing respect to Qasem Soleimani, or being elected officials, and mobilizing other people, Iranians, to vote, for example, for Rouhani. Now, I mean, some might say, well, isn't that great that they have broken off from the regime and they have joined the opposition? But there's a strong sense among many people that the regime has effectively infiltrated a lot of the opposition, in the sense that, in particular, Reza Pahlavi is not furthering the very inclusive discourse that he used to have, the pluralism, the unity, and is more and more listening to voices that say he shouldn't be sitting down with other opposition leaders, a coalition. I mean, believe it or not, the regime managed to make people feel that the Georgetown coalition was an attempt to destroy Iran, was an attempt to divide Iran and have it fall apart into different ethnic segments. And that kind of disinformation really took root and ultimately affected the opposition leaders themselves and their own decision-making. I mean, Reza Pahlavi decided to join the coalition and then decided to pull out. So that, for me at least, and I think for many people, if those kinds of issues are not solved, then we're going to continue to be in this place where the regime is running on one plane and the opposition is running on the other, two parallels that don't ever really impact each other. I mean, the opposition is continuing, particularly Reza Pahlavi, name recognition, interviews, speeches, and all of that. But at the same time, the actual reality on the ground, the gains of the people, is serious backsliding. I mean, where we were 2 years ago in Iran and where we are now is much worse place now. I mean, over 20,000 people were tortured, systematically tortured, raped because they participated in the Women Life Freedom Revolution. And for many, many people, after Mahsa Amini was killed, there were a few months there where they really wanted opposition leaders to come together so that there would be a chance of furthering the revolution, furthering its discourse, having real tactics. I mean, Reza Pahlavi announced, for example, a labor strike fund. All these things did not come to anything, unfortunately, and it fell apart. Yesterday, he spoke at the NatCon conference, and it was a departure from it was a very important speech, a very strong speech, but at the same time, it was a departure from his previous speeches in the sense that the word democracy was never mentioned. He referred to the people of Iran as an army. Well, they really are not an army. I mean, they're not armed. They are, they're the biggest thing they have going for them is their unity, their willingness, ability to work together across divisions, to understand that they need to just be together in order to succeed. And this is something that the opposition needs to learn from the people, unfortunately. He also spoke about Afghanistan. He made a very interesting point about Afghanistan. I had heard his aides make the same point privately, that if Afghanistan, if the people's desire for monarchy had been honored in the transition that Afghanistan had upon the US invasion, and they had gone the way of monarchy, then they would, as a country, have avoided chaos and instability. This is kind of, I mean, it's a counterfactual. There's no test for fallibility of the hypothesis. There are many variables, but there's so many things going on in that country that could have ended, could have resulted in the same situation that we see today, not least that the Islamic Republic would have continued even, after Afghanistan's transition, and the Islamic Republic is impacting other countries in the region. And regardless of the type of government in Afghanistan, it would be seriously impacted by what the Islamic Republic is up to in terms of, really, it's an imperialist foreign policy throughout the region. And if monarchy is such a force that can prevent chaos and instability, then what about Iran itself? In 1979, Iran had a monarchy and did not manage to thwart the rise of Islamist radicals. So I'm just mentioning these because the speech was yesterday. Again, it was an important speech, but it shows, I think, this gradual move that Reza Pahlavi has had from a discourse of democracy more and more towards really, maybe it's the venue of NatCon, but trying to move more towards maybe strongman politics. I'm not sure, but it raised a lot of eyebrows, and so I wanted to mention it here.
Thank you very much that, Mariam. And I want to touch on a few things and turn into a follow-on question for you. You mentioned the cyber army, the regime's efforts to basically sow dissension among the opposition. I would mention this comes the day after the director of national intelligence, Avril Haines, also noted that Iran is increasingly taking a playbook out of, she didn't say it, but Russian and other misinformation, disinformation operations to foreign influence efforts, as we call them, to stoke discord and undermine confidence in America's own democratic institutions and in democracy more general. So I think that's a particularly timely comment. And I want to get for the end here, talking about the potential for renewed U.S. Diplomacy with Iran and all sorts of those things. But I bring it up in a way of saying, I remember in 2009 during the protests, where there was a certain concern from the U.S. to not be seen to be supporting the protesters because it could jeopardize diplomatic outreach to the Iranian regime. And I worry that's a tension that maybe has not gone away. But this is all a big windup to pitch you a big question, which is, so where do we, the royal we, let's say the U.S. and our support for a democratic Iranian future, where do we go from here? What does real change actually require?
Yeah, and I think that what's happening with Iran's opposition is a sign of the times. It's part of a much larger global trend of authoritarianism and a lack of faith, if you will, by the world's democracies that they can impact the spread of freedom in the world. I mean, we're very far away from the way that Reagan took up the cause of dissidents behind the Iron Curtain and really pursued a policy over a decade of aiding Solidarność in Poland and being unapologetic about the fact that the United States supports the dissidents and the United States sees the USSR as an evil empire and that it is pursuing regime change of all those communist regimes. There is, as Ray mentioned, just a lack of real seriousness, I think, on the part of U.S. foreign policy when it comes to dealing with Iran. And the Trump maximum pressure policy is a much stronger one in terms of holding the regime accountable and preventing it from pursuing nefarious actions in the region in particular. And not so much, I think, on human rights, because they massacred over 1,500 people during the maximum pressure campaign, and that's actually even more than they killed under Women, Life, Freedom. I think the maximum pressure policy is a much, much better policy. But again, that one is also predicated on the assumption that this is pressure to arrive at a better deal with the regime. It's pressure to arrive at a better understanding of the regime and to behavior change from the regime. It is not, as Trump has emphasized himself, a regime change policy. That can change. I hope it does. It looks like Trump is going to be president. But so far it hasn't been that.
So, and thank you. That conveniently tees up the next round of questioning. But before I jump onto that, just a follow-up. You mentioned the successes the U.S. had in helping promote regime change in the Soviet bloc in the 80s. Are there any positive examples of what U.S. policy has done toward Iran in this regard at any point, or are we sort of drawing on a blank slate here in terms of trying to come up with a viable strategy to support democracy in Iran?
Well, when George Bush called Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, part of the axis of evil, that was very popular among the Iranian people. I also think the maximum pressure policy from Trump was enormously popular among the people. I think that we take for granted or underestimate how much leverage and power we do have through even just rhetorical statements. You know, when the president of the United States decides to mention, I remember Bush talked about Ganji when he was in prison. When at that time he was a Democratic dissident. How important that was, how much it resonated. Anyone who's president of the United States, if they talk about the democratic aspirations of the people of Iran, if they talk about the brutality of the regime, that has enormous power. It is not just soft power. It affects the calculus of the regime. And when the United States under Trump killed Soleimani, that was huge. I mean, I don't think I don't think I can recall anything else that's ever been done by a world power that the Iranian people since 1979 have responded more favorably toward.
Fascinating. And so to sort of proceed to maybe a more dismal and pessimistic outlook on where U.S.-Iran relations might be headed next, Ray, I want to turn to you. There's been plenty of chatter about the potential for rapprochement, for lack of a better word, with this new ostensibly softer face from the Iranian president. In terms, people have been talking about a resumption of nuclear diplomacy, et cetera, et cetera. And the potential for sanctions relief. To be kind of blunt, if you're the Iranians, why would you ever, at this point, the JCPOA is almost dead. The nuclear program is so far advanced. Why is there putting credence in this, or is this just chatter, or why would they actually have any strategic reason to try to resume negotiations?
I'll say a couple of things, but I want to touch on some of the things that Miriam has just suggested. I think the rhetoric in the United States, it should not just be limited to the president. If you look at the Soviet period, there were Senator Moynihan, Senator Jackson. There were a lot of people commenting on human rights issues within the Soviet bloc, and that was important. The labor unions, AFL-CIO. I mean, there was an entire civil society, human rights organizations within the United States, congressional leadership, and so forth. So I think there's an obligation on all elected leaders and civil society groups to the United States and Western Europe to forge a relationship with their Iranian counterparts. That sort of has multiple force effect, I would think. And the Congress always has had a historical role in actually promoting human rights, more so than the executive branch historically, for a variety of reasons in different situations. Going back to your question on the nuclear diplomacy, Pezeshkian did refer to the JCPOA, but I think the JCPOA in that context was a stand-in for a different conversation, whether Iran should have a less confrontational rhetoric abroad and so forth. Is there a room for renewal of the JCPOA? I don't think either party is necessarily interested in that, but I could see interim arrangements whereby Iran will grant the IAEA greater access for some sanctions relief, where Iran will stop production of 60% enriched uranium for some sanctions relief. So if you recall the JCPOA cycle, before that there was an interim deal called Joint Plan of Action in 2013, and that was followed by the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the final Iran deal. I think some modest version of Joint Plan of Action is something that people are looking at. But that the context is different at this point, right? You'll be essentially offering sanctions relief at this time to a country that is at war with NATO in Central Europe, that is mauling Israel through Gaza. I think we can do it. I remember the Biden administration was perfectly willing to engage with the Raisi government.
Mm-hmm.
There was no prohibition on the American side. And I would say, if you look at the 50 years since the Iranian Revolution of February 1979, every administration has been willing to engage with the Iranian government, irrespective of ebbs and flows of its human rights abuses. And I'm not sure if that's different today. There are two things that have, maybe we talked about this in the last JINSA conversation. There are two things that the American political class has convinced itself of or believes in somewhat. Number one is the durability of the Islamic Republic.
Mhm.
They believe this regime has all kinds of problems, perhaps has lost its legitimacy, but it has the ability to sustain itself in power. Number two, the importance of dealing with the nuclear issue, which constitutes an international security threat. And number three, the best way of dealing with the nuclear issue is to divest it from other issues of concern because it makes it kind of simpler, right? You're dealing with the arms control computation. I give you this, if you give me this rotor in this centrifuge at this year, as opposed to asking for behavioral change in the region or at home.
Mhm.
Those are three factors that underpin the JCPOA. I think those are three factors that underpin the American political class's approach to Iran. And so long as that's the fact, so if I'm right about this, and that, I don't know, maybe changing or not, depends on who you ask and on which day. But so long as those three verities are intact, I think you'll see limited room for discussion of internal change in Iran because it crosses the first of the three verities,
Yeah.
namely the Islamic Republic is durable. It survived the women's life freedom movement. It survived the 2017, 19, 2009 rebellions. So there's a measure of resiliency in its approach and ability to mobilize its sources and ability to disunite the opposition within and outside Iran. And if you can adjust that mindset, that's the beginning of imagination.
So very well put. But if that's the case, if for all the reasons you mentioned, Iran's in a pretty good spot right now in terms of their nuclear program has advanced to the threshold or latency of a weapons capability, whatever you want to call it. Um, but at the same time, we're hearing noises, chatter around DC, and then also from some of our allies and partners in the Middle East that the Iranians might actually be progressing toward the bomb itself, and whether that's having the capability to assemble one. We don't need to parse out the terms, but if you're the Iranian regime, wouldn't it, based on your argument, wouldn't it make sense to sort of stay where they are, rather absent some exogenous factor where they need to race to test? Aren't they in a good position right now, rather than risk, actually spurring the world to do something if they tested a bomb or provably had one?
The advancement of the nuclear program invites diplomacy, and diplomacy
Yeah.
entails concessions. So in that sense, your argument is not wrong. Uh, this bomb project has to come to some kind of a conclusion at some point. It is in the state of latency, but not going to the far. Some people talk about the Japan option for Iran, but Japan didn't pay a price for the Japan option. Iran is sanctioned for billions of dollars, right? Because of the Japan option is costing Iran money.
Mm-hmm.
It can get some of it back through diplomacy, but not all of it back. So the future of the Islamic Republic will be more enhanced and improved in aftermath of detonation. Because then the argument will be we cannot allow a country equipped with dangerous weapons to collapse. It'll be too dangerous to fall. And after a couple of months of protests, and they're going to say, well, they seem to be a reasonable custodians of the nuclear weapons. Remember, one of the axioms of American political science and therefore American thinking on this issue is that countries that achieve nuclear weapons capability tend to become more judicious because the danger is so much more enhanced. China became more judicious. The Soviet Union became more judicious. So nuclear weapons has a way of tempering revolutionary zeal. I don't think that's going to be the case in Iran's case. I'm not sure if it was the case in China or Russia's case, but that's aspect of the way the American political class will think about it, and certainly the way Europeans will think about it. So I think the future of the Islamic Republic looks better on the other side of the mushroom cloud. But that how they see it within their security councils is maybe different. I don't know.
Yeah, I realized I've asked a succession of perhaps impossible and unanswerable questions over the course of this hour. Mariam, is there anything you want to add on Ray's observations or on the nuclear issue more generally, just because it's such a core and massive issue?
Yeah, that was so interesting. And like I said, I always learn so much from Ray Take. One thing that I wonder about is if the pursuit of a nuclear weapon, like while the regime is on that path to a nuclear weapon, if that's not actually a more advantageous place for the regime to be than actually having the weapon, only because they're in such economic dire straits that on the path they can continue to get these concessions and appeasement. But once they have it, then maybe there's no reason. But having said that, the Europeans show basically that whatever the policies and behavior of the regime, they're willing to continue trading. And so I don't know.
Mhm. With the little time we have left, I want to move on to one more weighty and again perhaps in some sense unanswerable question, and that regards the succession of Supreme Leader Khamenei. Mariam, I'll ask this to you first. Uh, I feel like this is in some sense, an issue that's been telegraphed given the Supreme Leader's seemingly ailing health that never ends for year after year. I'm curious if, since Raisi's unexpected death, and then in the course of the recent months in the election, but also, as you mentioned, the issue of the woman life freedom movement, and the regime's declining legitimacy at home. At the very least, what do you think are the factors that might determine succession in terms of what kind of candidate they might be looking for, or could this just be an all-out chaotic process?
From my perspective, it's really hard to tell. Khamenei has been not your average dictator. I mean, he's proven himself, in my opinion, to be more capable, astute, sophisticated. Like Ray said, he's constantly tweaking, increasing the power of this faction over that one, putting people in their place when needs to be, and using all the levers that he has, basically. And creating this facade so that people from the outside world and also inside believe that this is not just a classic dictatorship, believe that there is a real system here and that the people are deciding, and all of that facade he's managed to sustain, even though it's been punctured in many ways, especially in this last election. And I imagine that Khamenei has documented what he wants to happen after he dies, so that there is a document there, and maybe he's entrusted it to a few people, but I think that it's hard to imagine it not being at least temporarily a chaotic time, even if there's a very clearly chosen successor, because in the public imagination, and also the imagination of the regime elites and the international community, all those actors, I don't think there's a clear successor. There's no one that comes to mind as well. Yes, obviously, So whoever Khamenei has chosen is going to raise some eyebrows, and it may unleash a power struggle among different factions within the IRGC.
So thank you for that. And Ray, I'll turn the last word over to you for your thoughts on the succession issue. I know we discussed this in a previous webinar right after Raisi's death, and maybe your thinking hasn't had any need to change in the meantime. But you had mentioned Raisi was often seen as one of the potential successors to Khamenei, and perhaps his mediocrity was one of the reasons that made him appealing. But I'm building on Mariam's comments, would just love your closing thoughts on sort of where you see the process of succession going, or if it is indeed unforeseeable.
Yeah, I think as Mariam mentioned, it's a black box. Ali Khamenei is a kind of planning. I I would think they consider a number of candidates. There was a talk that there was a three-person commission within the Assembly of Experts that was looking at candidates. Raisi was supposed to be one of the members of that commission. I think that's such an august position requiring ingenuity and imagination that Raisi wasn't up to it. Now, I don't know anybody is. Whoever succeeds Khomeini is going to look less impressive given how impressive Khomeini has been. So there's going to be a growth period. And they have to kind of sort this out before he dies, I would imagine. But, Khomeini may be one of those leaders, as we have seen, an aging leader who refuses to acknowledge his age. And he refuses to concede to succession. But it happens in other countries. It may be happening in this country. He's just thinking, if I don't think about succession, I'm not going to die.
Mm-hmm.
That's not his style of planning, but over the past years, I've seen things. Over the past years, I have learned to excise the following phrase from my lexicon. Wow, that's unusual.
Yeah, maybe we live in unprecedented times.
So,
One of our audience members snuck a question in right before the buzzer. What about Khamenei's son?
I don't know Miriam's perspective on this will be, I don't believe Islamic Republic can do dynastic succession. I think the place is full of Nepo babies. The nepotism, I don't, they're all related to somebody. But to have that position of supreme leader be your son, I think that's just it. But they may do that, and then there'll be nothing left of the egalitarian spirit that launched the original revolution. They may actually completely subvert the legacy of that revolution. They're certainly capable of it. That doesn't mean Mujtaba will not be a force behind the scenes, but my experience and observation of the Islamic Republic, a force behind the scene is not always as good as being a force on the scene.
Miriam, any final thoughts or word on the question of potential dynastic succession?
Yeah, the last point Ray made reminded me of Rafsanjani. I mean, he was considered to be the most, I think, after Mortazavi, the most likely to succeed the first supreme leader, Khomeini, and then he kind of pulled himself out in a way so that he could be behind the scenes, and they made Khamenei, the current supreme leader and Ayatollah. He was only a Hajat al-Islam, and he was resistant himself, thinking, oh, this is not a legitimate move. How can you make me the successor? But then over time, Rafsanjani didn't fare so well, and didn't have the kind of power behind the scenes that I think he thought that he would always have. To answer your question, I don't know. I really don't. I don't know enough about the internal dynamics, but I agree with Ray's point that Mujtaba, the son of the current supreme leader, making him the next supreme leader would look awfully too much like a monarchy, and this regime overthrew a monarchy, and it would be cause for just on its face a new round of protests. But I think the way it's looking right now, the chance of some instability is more than not having instability when Khamenei dies.
Well, thank you. And that takes us right up to the 2:00 mark. I'd like to thank our panelists, Miriam and Ray, for joining us for their time today. Thank you to our audience, as always, for joining us. Keep your eyes peeled for upcoming work later this year from JINSA's Iran Policy Project, of which Ray is a long-serving member. And everyone be sure to follow Mariam on social media. Thank you again for joining us. Look forward to seeing you on another JINSA webinar soon.
Thank
you.